Welcome to episode 16 of the G2 on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 15 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel Sag. Let's get started, but before we do, Anshel, why don't you flash a picture up? I spent the yesterday and today with my 2 college-age daughters, and just to show the audience my dedication to the podcast, this picture was taken on top of Enchanted Rock, which is a beautiful nature preserve about an hour and a half outside of Texas. And the views are amazing. And so wanted to share that with everyone and rushed back in time so that we could record this podcast.
You're still wearing the hat.
And I'm still wearing that. You know, God bless Texas, hook 'em horns. So let's get started. And on this first topic, Anshel and I are going to kind of tag team it. But there was an announcement from the White House on August 10th. They call it a fact sheet, and it wrapped up several different elements into one big sort of bravado announcement. And really what it was pointed towards was the fact that the U.S. government is going to free up the very valuable mid-band spectrum, do that on a global basis to accelerate 5G deployment and offer that through the FCC auction. Anshel's going to talk a little bit more about it. But I thought it was interesting the way the whitehouse.gov packaged this up, because they spoke to that. Then they also addressed the deregulation that's been occurring, tax incentives to drive 5G deployment, as well as a lot of the deregulation. So I find it interesting in an election year how the White House packaged that up. But I shared my insights on Twitter. I think it's a good thing. We talk a lot about T-Mobile and how they have a very wide spectrum footprint. We call it the layer cake, low, mid, and high band. Some of their competitors in the tier 1 space are missing sort of that critical mid-band. And why it's critical is that mid-band delivers a great balance of propagation and distance and performance. So I think this is a very positive thing. But Anshel, why don't you go a little bit deeper into your analysis on what this really means for operators and service providers?
So I think, first of all, they're freeing up 100 megahertz of spectrum in the 3.4 to 3.5 band, which is as mid-band as it gets. A lot of countries are actually already have freed up that band for mid-band. So it's kind of like a globally harmonized mid-band for 5G. So that's a good thing for sure. Also, this is a 100 megahertz block in addition to what's being freed up from CBRS and C-band. So it's going to actually accumulate to an aggregate of 530 megahertz of mid-band spectrum available, which is a lot. Because honestly, there's a lot of stuff that's already in that space, and freeing up that much spectrum is going to be very valuable. Obviously, there's going to be some sharing rules that are going to have to be implemented in certain areas to not impede certain military frequencies or telecommunications. But the reality is that in order to have the coverage that we are used to, but also getting those gigabit 5G speeds, you need mid-band. You can't accomplish it with low band because you need large chunks of bandwidth in order to get a gig, and 20 megahertz blocks are not going to cut it anymore.
Right.
So that's part of the reason why T-Mobile's purchase of Sprint was such a big deal, because they bought themselves almost 200 megahertz of mid-band spectrum. Granted, it is 2.5, so it will carry further than 3.5 will. So they don't need to have as dense of a deployment. But I actually think what's going to be very interesting is the 2 operators that need mid-band the most, which are Verizon and AT&T, do not have the network density that they need to make that a blanket coverage, 5G network. So they're going to have to densify further. Obviously, they're not going to have to densify as much as if they had stuck with just millimeter wave, which was kind of how they initially launched their 5G networks. But they absolutely need mid-band. And I know that Verizon's already been very aggressive in acquiring mid-band. So I think AT&T is obviously going to be a big bidder here. for this spectrum. But I also think there are going to be other bidders like Dish who's trying to build out their network.
Yeah.
And I don't think they get any mid-band because they mostly got low band.
Low band from T-Mobile. Yeah.
And,
yeah. You touched on CBRS. Now, my understanding, right, is that this is going to be a traditional FCC auction, right? So it's not going to be through the CBRS.
Right. It's a traditional auction.
Got it.
But all of the spectrum will be available to operators.
Right.
And they're aggregating all of the spectrum that's available for 5G that isn't implemented yet as part of that 530 megahertz aggregate number. But realistically, you're right. They're going to have to bid on it, and it's going to cost a lot of money. And I don't see T-Mobile being a bidder, but I could see Comcast being a potential bidder because they're trying to build out their cell network. We could see some licenses going to a like a U.S. Cellular or any other company looking to kind of build out a new network. But realistically, I think we kind of already know who the players are in the space, and I don't see anybody really being able to compete with AT&T or Verizon on a bidding war.
No, I agree. Yeah, they've got the deep war chests, and it'd be interesting. I think U.S. Cellular they primarily service rural. That's been a big focus of the Trump administration, and Chairman Pai as well. So it will be interesting to see how kind of things roll out. I mean, certainly this will be a big money maker and revenue generator for the federal government, but it's all good. I think it provides additional capabilities with respect to mid-band spectrum for the AT&Ts of the world that are definitely lacking it. So let's shift to my second topic this week. And Rakuten announced their 2Q financials. No surprises, losses there as they continue to deploy out their network. I did find it interesting. One of the big key highlights they focused on was how they're deploying their RCP platform, which is the Rakuten communications platform. And they're claiming a CapEx reduction of up to 40% and an OpEx reduction of up to 30%. And a lot of this is, leveraging Open RAN. And, I've weighed in on this, and I've contributed, to a Forbes article on the subject. And certainly it's going to be very CapEx disruptive when, you're virtualizing a lot of the radio heads and that sort of thing. But I'm still not sold on the fact that it's an OpEx reducer, because when you introduce software, when you introduce more players into the ecosystem, it drives complexity. So I don't know. Do you have any other thoughts on that?
I saw as part of their earnings announcement that they were saying that they expect to have 70% of the Japanese population covered by March 2021, and that they expect to have 96% covered by summer of next year. So that's a very aggressive rollout.
It is.
They're expecting to have. Yes, Japan is very dense, and yes, most of the population lives in very dense cities. But apparently that they've already deployed 5,700 sites as of June, and they've got another 7,400 sites under contract. So they're definitely moving more aggressively than they even had anticipated. Because originally they said that they would cover 96% of the country by 2026. So being able to do that 5 years earlier obviously is a big difference. I think that 2026 number most likely did not incorporate their current disaggregated model. But I think with this new model that they've been deploying with, I think they can roll it out much more quickly, and it's going to be very interesting to see if they can actually cover that much of the country that quickly.
Yeah, and that's certainly one of the advantages of using, an Open RAN platform is that, it brings agility. What's interesting, and you were a part of this as well, Anshel, the firm, we collectively wrote a series of 6 articles last summer on who the leaders were in 5G. And I looked at, carriers and infrastructure. Obviously, I cover that. You cover end devices, VR, AR, mixed reality. But, Japan has been somewhat of a laggard with respect, deploying 5G, in my opinion. So this would be interesting if, and Rakuten has always made very bold claims. Their leadership is very bold. But it'll be interesting if they can sort of put Japan back on the fast track.
Absolutely. And their CEO is, he's got all the energy in the universe to talk up their model.
Exactly. So yeah, time will tell. It'll be interesting. So let's shift to your second topic this week, and you wanted to share some information on Ericsson wins, and I've been following, this as well. But what are the details there?
Well, it's basically that Ericsson has been making deals, and they managed to secure essentially their 100th network deal. So they basically, they've been the first operator, infrastructure vendor to be, rolling out with a lot of the 5G networks. So it's been a lot of them and Huawei and Nokia, and even Samsung, but they have the overwhelming, number of networks that they've rolled out in. And I think it helps them that they're in the US, as well as Europe and Asia. So they have global coverage. Huawei is struggling in that sense because they can't get into some countries. So that's limiting them. And then Nokia, because they've been a laggard, doesn't have as many 5G deployments as their other competitors do. So it makes sense that, Ericsson would have signed their 100th deal. It was actually with the Slovenian telecom carrier, Telekom Slovenia, on August 12th. So that was kind of their 100th deal. They said that they've already announced that 100 figure includes 58 publicly announced contracts and 56 live networks spanning 5 continents. So they've got global coverage. I think they're pretty happy from what I've seen in terms of their momentum. They did have a little bit of slowness last year from what I recall. And I think, COVID has been kind of a mixed bag for a lot of companies. But I think considering everything, 100 deals is pretty good considering how early we are in deployment of 5G.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm not surprised to see this because, when you look at the other big competitors, I always call it big infrastructure. And that includes obviously the companies you've mentioned, Samsung Networks, Huawei, and Nokia. Nokia has been somewhat distracted. They have a new CEO that's taking the helm. And so I think, Ericsson may have taken advantage of a little bit of that fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But it'll be interesting to see how things roll out with Nokia's new leadership. Like you mentioned, Huawei, they are struggling. I'm going to talk about Huawei as my third topic in a moment. Given some of the the restrictions that continue to go on, most recently in the UK and certainly in the US, and you're seeing other parts of the world get behind that as well. So yeah, and so I feel like Ericsson's got a very solid portfolio. They've sort of reinvented themselves. They're very focused on software defined. They're not necessarily throwing themselves behind Open RAN, but certainly, from a virtualization perspective, leveraging AI, they've been a leader. So again, I'm not surprised to see that, but it'll be interesting to see how things continue to progress among these big four. But so with that, let's shift to my third topic this week, and it's Huawei, as I mentioned, and I've talked about this before. The entity listing was sort of the first step in the U.S. salvo with Huawei, and then that proceeded to semiconductor and a presidential order that was signed a few months ago around prohibiting foundries that use American semiconductor manufacturing equipment to supply foreign entities, in particular Huawei and ZTE. And so this week, we're starting
American allies too.
Exactly. And so this week news came out that we're beginning to see some of the effects of that semiconductor blockade with Huawei. And in particular, TSMC. I mean, they're a huge fab based in Taiwan. Huawei announced that they will be ceasing production of a key piece of silicon. It's the Kirin artificial intelligence chipset. And from my perspective, I don't cover devices, you certainly do, so I'd love to hear some of your color on this. But I really have felt that that's been a key differentiator for the company, integrating AI silicon. And they've had a very ambitious goal of integrating AI silicon, custom silicon, into all of their devices. So whether it's infrastructure for the enterprise, service provider, or devices, that's been a key differentiator for them. And so because Huawei only has design capability with its high silicon operation, they don't have fab capability. they announced they're going to have to cancel, the production because TSMC will no longer be able to supply them. So I believe long term, and I've spoken to this, that Huawei is going to have to pivot and invest in the billions of dollars that are required to bring up a fab. But you're closer to the end devices, so I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
So basically, it's the Kirin, the Kirin is their flagship smartphone processor.
Right.
And it's basically what powers their flagship phones. And the thing is that the reason why it can't be produced elsewhere is because TSMC is the leading foundry in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to produce that chip in the economical yield base that works for power and performance, it needs to be manufactured at TSMC. There are no alternatives.
Yeah.
They've already invested in SMIC or SMIC, which is a Chinese fab, but they're not anywhere near where TSMC is.
Sure.
So for maybe some of Huawei's older chipsets, they could, but not for their leading stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to have to lean on other chipset manufacturers to make this chip for them. But the thing is that they could either buy a Qualcomm chipset, which is what Qualcomm has been trying to push for supposedly,
Mm-hmm.
which would be an American chip company, which I'm not sure the Trump administration would allow, which is why it's been kind of a questionable thing. But they could also go to MediaTek and use their Dimensity 1000 chipset, because MediaTek is a Taiwanese company. And they aren't yet on that border, but they could be. But they mostly sell to Chinese OEMs.
Yeah.
So, this would kind of level the playing field between Huawei and a lot of their competitors, at least on the chipset side, which would make things very interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's an unfortunate position because, Kirin is Huawei's own design based on ARM, GPU and CPU. And they've had some interesting, designs there. But generally speaking, I would say it won't be a huge difference for them, because their performance is kind of on par with a lot of other competitors. And actually, Huawei hasn't been updating some of their CPU cores, but the latest one that ARM is offering. So it's not as big of a loss as I think as some people would think, but it definitely will affect their profitability and their margin, because they're no longer manufacturing their own chip.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like we have a slightly different opinion on it, but hey, that's the spice of life, right? So it'll be interesting to see how things roll there. So let's move to your third topic, and you've got some information on T-Mobile and some site statistics.
Yeah, so like we mentioned in the previous podcast, and during their analyst I don't know what to call it, the analyst briefing that we had last week, they kind of told us that they're bringing up about 1,000. They are already in planning to bring up 1,000 2.5 gigahertz sites per month. But apparently that number is now increasing to 700 sites per week, and they want to bring it up to 800 sites per week. And it seems like it's kind of a combination of both 600 and 2.5. But really, what they're really talking about now is 2.5, because 600 they've rolled out significantly and is already nationwide. And 2.5 is what's one, what they paid for, but two, it's also what's going to give them that multi-gig 5G bandwidth.
Right.
So they're talking about rolling it out in a mid 50,000 range. In that they will have about between around 55,000 2.5G sites. Obviously, most of those are going to be refarmed, repurposed Sprint sites. But they're also going to obviously as well, they'll bring up a bunch of new sites as well. And they said that they are going to have a lot of this done over the next 2.5 years, which is their plan. But they really want to already take advantage of that spectrum aggressively next year.
Yeah, I believe, you kind of talk about the refarm, and certainly I think they'll count as they refarm these Sprint sites, they'll count that in the numbers. But prior to the merger, I spent some time with John Saw, who will be on our next episode, and you'll talk more about that at the end of the podcast here. But he was talking about Sprint's use at the time of massive MIMO antennas that can be split just to support both LTE and 5G. So I expect from an infrastructure perspective, that'll be part of the recipe and the plan there.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that it's definitely something that will benefit the company because they're already dealing with a significant amount of load on the network from COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
So having that 2.5 gives them so much more capacity that they didn't have before, that it can actually free up some of the 600 megahertz spectrum and the other spectrum that they're already using for 4G. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how quickly they're actually able to roll this out and whether or not they're really able to, if they're going to hit that mid 50,000 figure by 2024.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's they're moving quickly. They so far they've delivered on everything that they said they could do.
Yeah, and I tell you, I call it, going back to my product marketing days, we called it a rolling thunder campaign, and it seems like T-Mobile's been rolling the thunder over the last several weeks, right? With these different announcements, financials and the SA deployment and now this. So they're not messing around. And I think I read something, parent Deutsche Telekom, Papa's pretty proud of their child in the U.S. So
I think also, if you think about it, they probably had planned most of this before the merger was approved.
True.
Because the merger took so long to approve.
They had time to really put the plan together.
Exactly. Yeah. Really set the groundwork. And once that agreement was set, they lit up a bunch of cities already.
Yeah.
And, they just haven't stopped since. Like that, they like lit that fuse and it just keeps going.
Yeah. Yeah. That great observation, buddy. Well, hey, another great podcast this week. Why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. So we hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide us with insight on a topic that they would like us to cover that's around 5G on a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Willtown Tech, and I'm at Anshel Sog. We hope that you have a great weekend, and please tune in again next week when we have T-Mobile's John Saw on the podcast.